Lost media is any form of media that once was, and now isn't. Many of the earliest films from the beginning of the 20th century are considered to be lost media, as they have either perished due to age or simply been misplaced somewhere along the line. Either way, there is no way to enjoy them, and for all intents and purposes, they do not exist anymore. But those things are old. Surely that could never happen these days, right? Wrong. While technically not lost media, Castlevania Adventure ReBirth is what I like to consider legally lost media. There is absolutely no way to legally obtain a copy of this game without temporally being in the years between 2009 and 2019, and as I record this in April of 2021, I am not currently between either of those years. I suppose there is still one way to get this game, and that would be to purchase a Wii second-hand that already has it installed, but good luck with finding one of those. You see, Castlevania Adventure ReBirth was a game developed by M2 for the then new and fascinating WiiWare. Adventure ReBirth was a WiiWare exclusive, meaning that no physical versions of the game ever came to exist. So when the Wii Shop channel was finally laid to rest back in January of 2019, so too was Castlevania Adventure ReBirth. Now if you know me, you'll know that I love me some vintage Castlevania style gameplay, and if you know me, then you'll know I'm also a fan of Castlevania Adventure, despite what everyone else says about it. Unfortunately, one of the many mistakes I made in my teenage years was passing up on the opportunity to purchase Castlevania Adventure ReBirth. I wasn't a Castlevania fan then. I didn't know the opportunity that lay in front of me. I was too busy playing Mario Kart Wii and making meaningful relationships with my peers to look at Castlevania. I was a fool back then! However, like I said, Castlevania Adventure ReBirth is legally lost media. It's not actually lost, at least if you know where to look. So, let's find out then. Is Konami keeping a hidden treasure away from the physical world, or are they hiding a prettier looking version of the Game Boy game that only I seem to appreciate? Let's find out. There are two questions that can be addressed when discussing whether Adventure ReBirth is a, quote, good Castlevania game. The first of which being, is it a good Castlevania game? To which the answer is, yes, it is. The second question, though, is a bit more interesting, and that, of course, is it a good remake or rebirth of Castlevania Adventure? To which I, the sole fan and appreciator of Castlevania Adventure, say, no, it is not. At the end of the day, do I want to play through Adventure or Adventure ReBirth? Ha! It's Adventure ReBirth for sure, but that doesn't mean I'm still not a little bit disappointed by it, so let's start by addressing that second question first. If we stop and think about what makes Adventure ReBirth a remake of Adventure and not, say, any other Castlevania game, what does it have that outside of its name conveys this to us? What differentiates Adventure from your typical Castlevania game? Remember, these are 8-bit games we're talking about. The amount of nuance and subtlety that can go into them is pretty limited. I would argue that the music, level, and enemy design are really going to be the big differences between Adventure and other Vania games that came out before ReBirth. Now, for as much as people talk crap about Adventure, from an objective standpoint, I really don't think the level design would be all that bad if the controls were just a little tighter. I don't know, call me crazy, but that platforming gauntlet on the third stage is pretty stressful, and I love it for that. If you've played this level and have gotten frustrated to no end by the tight jumps you have to make, imagine if Christopher's jump arc was just slightly more forgiving like it is in most other Castlevania games. It would make this an awesomely terrifying segment instead of the mild discomfort in the ass that it is. The bosses that we face may have broken hitboxes, but they're still pretty fun ideas. A giant suit of armor that later becomes a regular enemy, a gargoyle, and an onslaught of creepy frog goblins. This last one has some serious creepy potential if we just had a bit more graphics power to play around with. Ropes! There's ropes everywhere! Stairs in old Castlevania games were annoying and cumbersome, but the ropes in Adventure, well, but really the ropes in Belmont's Revenge, changed up the pace and gave the game a different aesthetic to play with. And contrary to almost every other Castlevania game ever, we drop down into Dracula's lair, and that final fight is terrifying and different from any other Dracula fight to come before or after. ReBirth ignores all of this stuff. I mean, there's rolling eyeballs and spikes that come out of the walls, but they don't feel like they did in Adventure. We don't have an intense scramble up a rising spike floor, or those guys that throw rubber balls all over the place. Adventure gave off this Avatar: The Last Airbender climbing through the sewers of Omashu vibe to entering Dracula's castle, if you know what I mean. It feels like we're climbing through some long-forgotten torture chamber back exit to get to this guy, and end up just dropping right into his lair as opposed to climbing the stairs to see our old pal for a nice glass of wine. The final fight with Dracula is short, brutal, and unlike any other fight with him that the series had seen before this, but in ReBirth it's exactly what you'd expect from any other Castlevania game. You just walk up the stairs and, oh, well, watch out for those fireballs. None of this is bad. In fact, it's all pretty good. ReBirth is awesome, but it's not really Castlevania Adventure. But what really kills me is the music. While I may be the only person on this planet that enjoys playing Castlevania Adventure, I know for a fact that I'm far from the only person who really enjoys listening to Castlevania Adventure. If you've played it before, think back to that first stage. Holy heck! Did you even know the Game Boy could produce stereo audio? The song's title is Battle of the Holy, and my god, is that ever an apt description. You feel like you've been sent by God himself to smite the evil that is Dracula as you leisurely walk through a graveyard to get to his castle. The beat bounces back and forth through your brain while the melody pulls you forward through your mama-paced stroll through the first stage. The first song is so goddamn catchy, I was involuntarily humming it around for weeks. Goodness gracious, was I ever excited to hear these songs with the new sound font. But what is the Stage 1 theme in ReBirth? It's Reincarnated Soul from Castlevania Bloodlines on the Genesis. A good song, sure, but that's not Adventure. In fact, not a single track from Adventure is in Castlevania Adventure ReBirth. Even the ending theme is ripped from Belmont's Revenge and not Adventure. The cruelest part is that Battle of the Holy was redone, but wasn't used for the actual game itself. So, is Castlevania Adventure ReBirth a good reimagining of Castlevania Adventure? No, it's awful. ReBirth does to Adventure what Super Castlevania 4 does to the original Castlevania, and if you know me, you'll know that I think that's a bad thing. But if we shift our perspective and instead consider Adventure ReBirth as simply an homage to the original Game Boy trilogy as a whole, then things start to look significantly different to me. After revisiting the first two games in the series and playing through Legends for the first time, I find that Adventure ReBirth does a fantastic job at continuing the type of game design that made all three of these games good, though I can't help but be absolutely perplexed as to why they decided to do a reimagining of a Game Boy game that no one seems to like as a digital-only game for the Wii. Regardless of that, though, Adventure ReBirth captures the spirit of those three titles, but brings them into the next generation of gaming. And by that, I mean the 16-bit generation. Are these graphics actually 16-bit? Well, no, the pixel art doesn't even adhere to its pixel limitations all the time, but the influence of games like Rondo of Blood and Castlevania Bloodlines are evident, at least from a stylistic perspective, but we'll get to that a little later. Right now, we want to assess how ReBirth builds upon the Castlevania Game Boy trilogy. Each of these three games is wildly different from the next, but there are in fact a couple of common elements that make them feel like they are part of their own trilogy outside of just being released for the same console. The most notable of these, of course, being the Fire Whip. When you've upgraded your whip 3 times, in addition to getting a chain whip, you're also able to shoot out a fire blast that works similarly to how the throwing knife does in other Castlevania games. Getting this upgrade in each of the original 3 games made a huge difference, especially in the first and third incarnations, given their lack of sub-weapons, and sure enough, it makes a return in ReBirth, though it works a little differently than it did before. The flame upgrade is on a set time limit, indicated to the player by a gauge that continuously depletes over time. The flame will also not travel across the entire screen anymore, so it isn't quite as useful as it once was. In Legends, the Flame Whip was pretty much mandatory if you wanted to get through a level without taking too much damage, but in ReBirth, levels are designed in a much more player-friendly way so that you're never at a huge disadvantage if your whip cools off before you were expecting it to. However, this negates the entire purpose of Adventure's initial reason for having the Fire Whip, making whip upgrades actually matter. Adventure made it so that anytime you got hit, your whip would downgrade by a single level, meaning you had to play carefully. Not only was there a real danger of losing the Fire Whip, but there was also a danger of losing your Chain Whip. While it wasn't implemented quite perfectly in Adventure, Belmont's Revenge made it work much better. Rather than any enemy downgrading your whip, only the rubber balls would, and they were made much more predictable than they were in Adventure, so it was still possible to get your whip downgraded to leather, but it would only happen to you if you weren't being careful. But in ReBirth, this idea gets thrown out the window, since the Fire Whip is just a temporary upgrade. No matter what you do, you'll never be able to hold on to it, but you'll also never get sent back to the leather whip if you've got the chain whip, so for most of the game, you're gonna be using the chain whip, and once again, whip upgrades don't really matter. I think having the Fire Whip be permanent unless you get hit, like how the Plasma Whip upgrades work in Bloodlines, would have been a good remedy to the situation, but sadly, the Fire Whip is simply just a cute toy to play around with for 30 seconds. I mentioned earlier that level design is a bit more player-friendly than it was in Legends, and a big reason for this is because ReBirth takes after Belmont's Revenge more so than it does Adventure or Legends, and includes sub-weapons to even out the combat. Actually, there's even more sub-weapons in ReBirth than there were in Belmont's Revenge. The sub-weapons balance the experience so that you don't feel like you need to lean on your Fire Whip nearly as much as you did in the Game Boy games. Levels are designed in a way that force the player to rely on each of the different sub-weapons more so than the Fire Whip. Some levels even take a page out of Adventure and have a larger focus on platforming than they do enemy encounters, with the player needing to ascend walls of protruding spikes and slip in between crushing walls and break away floors. While you can certainly make it through these levels using only the whip, having the correct sub-weapon will make the level much easier to get through. ReBirth pays homage to the winding level designs of both Belmont's Revenge and Legends by giving the player different paths they can take to the end. Some routes simply lead to bonuses or secrets, but others lead you down vastly different paths, often with distinctly different environmental graphics. It feels like the split paths in Belmont's Revenge are being fully realized here in ReBirth. Belmont's Revenge's branching levels made little difference on the journey aside from a couple of different enemy encounters, but ReBirth's levels give the player an entirely different experience. I called Belmont's Revenge a great example of how to make a sequel, and M2 clearly saw the leaps that Belmont's Revenge made on Adventure and set out to do the same, but with Belmont's Revenge itself. Several songs, such as the end theme, are also taken from Belmont's Revenge, but remixed with the new ReBirth sound font. Again, I'm still upset that none of Adventure's music was used, but Belmont's Revenge had an arguably better soundtrack than even Adventure. However, if there was one thing that really shows that this is a remake of Adventure, that would have to be the rolling eyeballs. These guys were featured in both Adventure and Belmont's Revenge, and at least for me, they were the standout enemy. Not only were they creepy and weird, but they also exploded and caused the floor to break underneath them. Then, in Belmont's Revenge, you could keep the eyeballs from exploding by tossing some holy water on them, which was a nice touch, but the player wasn't ever really given any great reward for doing this. In ReBirth, the eyeballs are here again, which is great, but they don't do much aside from just roll around. They don't even break the glass they roll onto, or explode. Although, there is a giant eyeball boss, so that's neat at least. Aside from what I've just mentioned though, ReBirth has an identity all its own. While it may claim to be a reimagining of Adventure, I'd say it acts more like a spiritual successor to Rondo of Blood and Bloodlines. Upon first playing ReBirth, I saw the graphical style, heard the soundtrack, and immediately thought back to Rondo of Blood on the PC Engine CD and Bloodlines on the Genesis. So, naturally I went back and played through those games again too, and just, wow. Both of these games are just so good. And upon replaying them, I did notice a bunch of stuff that was either borrowed from or inspired by them in ReBirth. The most striking thing is definitely the soundtrack and sound font in general. Many of the songs throughout ReBirth are either actual songs taken from Bloodlines or have hints of that signature Genesis sound chip sprinkled throughout them. It makes ReBirth feel more like a tribute to Bloodlines than it does Adventure. But there are a lot of smaller details that originate from Rondo of Blood, such as the animation frames of the whip, specifically this middle one. Look at that! It looks so good! And they had it in Rondo of Blood too, but I feel like it just works a bit better in ReBirth. You can really feel the weight of Christopher's whip in it. And this added pullback frame is absolutely brilliant. These two frames convey a sense of weight and technique to the whip crack that no other Castlevania game has. This animation is a goddamn work of art. And look at Christopher's death animation. It's like frame for frame taken from Rondo. And of course there are the keys you can find throughout the levels in ReBirth, just like you could in Rondo to unlock secrets. Throughout ReBirth there are many locked gates that can only be opened using a key that replaces your subweapon. As far as I know, Rondo of Blood was the first game in the Castlevania series to implement this mechanic, allowing the player to find hidden secrets or save certain NPCs, but in ReBirth, this idea is used a little bit differently. While there unfortunately aren't any NPCs to save or alternate characters to unlock, there are, however, wildly branching levels and bonuses to find. ReBirth mixes the stylings of Belmont's Revenge's alternate paths with Rondo of Blood's locked door mechanics to create levels that have multiple paths that can only be accessed by figuring out which locked doors to open. You only ever get one key per level, and once you open a gate, you lose the key, so you gotta experiment and find out which doors lead to what. Maybe it's better to skip the alternate path because the reward behind a future locked door is a better investment, but maybe the alternate path makes the rest of the level much easier to get through. Sadly, there aren't alternate level endings leading to secret levels like there are in Rondo, but The levels that are here are big, and like I said before, the alternate paths often feature a much different visual aesthetic to the main path, so I can forgive this. Plus, the chandeliers are back! These were like the coolest part about Bloodlines, and there are so many more of them here, and with much more dynamic usage. I don't know, man, there's just some visceral satisfaction about knocking a chandelier down on top of your enemies that I just cannot get enough of. With all the throwbacks to Castlevania games of the 16-bit era, though, it's a real shame that the stair jumping wasn't added to this game. It really does slow down the pace of the game, having to walk up an entire flight of stairs instead of being able to jump on and off whenever you want. It boggles my mind why they neither had ropes to climb in place of stairs, nor the ability to jump on and off of stairs. Either one of those things would have made the game just all the more fast-paced and a great throwback to the games that ReBirth is based off of, but they didn't do either. But missteps aside, the controls are perfect. There are even two different ways to control Christopher, those being normal and classic. In normal mode, Christopher controls very similar to how Simon does in Castlevania 4, where he can accelerate mid-air. With classic, you're stuck with dedicated jump arcs, but this also means that you can attack while jumping away from enemies, which can be a major help. However, with Classic mode, you're also restricted to only using the Holy Water and the Cross, since those were the only sub-weapons available in Belmont's Revenge, at least in the Japanese version. And if you get hit while you have the Flame Whip, it'll go away. So overall, Classic mode is a bit more difficult to use. While it's definitely inspired by previous games from the 16-bit era and the Game Boy games, ReBirth really is its own unique entry in the Castlevania series. It's got its own visual flair and sound design. Even with just a screenshot or quick sample of the music, you can immediately differentiate between ReBirth and other games in the series. I'm particularly fond of the graphical style that ReBirth uses. To the unobservant observer, ReBirth looks like a 16-bit, maybe 32-bit Castlevania game. However, upon closer inspection, we can see that the game is not actually pixel perfect. Take a look at that red skeleton falling down. See how the pixels rotate? You can't do that on old hardware. Pixels have to be rigid and well-defined. When used willy-nilly, I really don't like this effect, but ReBirth uses it sparingly, so it was kind of fun for me to look out for instances where pixels weren't acting exactly how they were supposed to. It invokes a feeling of nostalgia for 16-bit graphics while simultaneously doing things that they couldn't do before. It looks like how we think those old games used to look. And similarly, the music sounds like how we think those old games used to sound. The soundtrack is heavily inspired by Castlevania Bloodlines, where the main melody of most tracks sound like they could have been produced with the Yamaha sound chip from a Sega Genesis, but the other instruments that create the texture of audio are not Megadrive samples. Take a listen to Reincarnated Soul, the first stage theme, compared to the Genesis original. While I think the bass line of the original is a bit more palpable, ReBirth's rendition feels like it's bringing the song from old hardware onto something more powerful, which, well, is exactly what it is doing. There's also this one sample that is used throughout most of the tracks that sounds like a dog barking or something that I absolutely love. You can hear it really well in the song Aquarius. The one thing I don't like about the sound design, though, is that some sound effects are clearly just free, unlicensed sounds, like the slugs being killed. I mean, I've heard that sound in so many different cartoons before, it just totally throws me out of the game whenever I hear it. But let's think back to that first question I asked. Is Castlevania Adventure ReBirth a good Castlevania game? For those of you who paid attention, you'll remember that I said yes. Yes, it is. ReBirth's level design is sprawling, branching, yet also linear. ReBirth is the kind of game you could play once, but if you do, you're doing it wrong. The multiple branching pathways of ReBirth, along with its linear design, highly encourage repeat playthroughs just to see what else you might have missed on your first go-around. The first couple of levels start off manageably enough, but the game gets really hard later on. Thankfully, there are infinite continues, so you can keep trying for as long as you have the willpower to do so. ReBirth doesn't do anything terribly original with its level design aesthetically, but you'll find that you're doing a lot more than just moving to the right to proceed. There are hardly any bottomless pits to worry about, so the real challenge comes from enemies. You have to use your sub-weapons effectively, but sparingly. It's hard to hit enemies with the whip consistently given its limited range, and I feel like I was always lower on hearts than in other games. Most sub-weapons actually use more than one heart per use, so you've really got to be careful about when you use them. Enemies, for the most part, are your typical Castlevania-style baddies, with a couple of nice throwbacks like those roly-polies and the eyeballs, though I really liked these mecha hunchback hermit crab guys. Even when they die, they can still hurt you. However, my favorite is probably Greninja over here. He reminds me of the invisible ninjas from the Atari 7800 game Ninja Golf. There's actually a lot of enemies that seem to only appear in secret areas, or areas that you have the ability to take alternate routes around, so you might not get to see every monster the game has on a single playthrough, which is a pretty neat idea. Then there are, of course, the bosses. Unfortunately, we don't get to see the frog goblins from Adventure and Belmont's Revenge, but what we're left with is still pretty cool. A giant rock monster, an evil sword, a big man. Interestingly, none of the Game Boy games had a fight with death, but ReBirth does, so make sure to remember that if you ever go on a Castlevania trivia game show or something. None of the bosses are particularly tricky. It's really the levels that will beat your booty, though the final fight with Mr. Vlad Tepes took me a good hard several tries, but it's nothing radically different or special compared to other Dracula boss encounters. So yeah, overall, ReBirth is a good Castlevania game. It doesn't do all that much to stand out from the other greats like Rondo of Blood or Belmont's Revenge, but its visual style and sound design, squishy bugs notwithstanding, really elevate it to another level. There's a reason you can find so many fan-made Castlevania musical arrangements done in the style of ReBirth. It's just a cool sound font. So, if Konami ever takes a break from making pachinko machines and decides to release games again, or even just re-release games again, I hope they change the status of ReBirth from legally lost media to just regular media. I'm Bofner, and thanks for watching. See ya!